all hear me?
Yes, we hear you, Tom.
Okay, great. Thank you. It is my pleasure to introduce Ron Gibbs, president of the California Map Society. I've known Ron for only about a year, and even though I've never met him in person or shaken his hand, I consider him to be a good friend. We talk at least once a week, sometimes more, collaborating on California Map Society events, as well as his exhibit of revolutionary maps on the digital gallery. He is smart, funny, kind, inspiring, determined, gracious, and wise. And he is also my general. Born in Philadelphia, he received his MD from the University of Pennsylvania and served in the U.S. Army at Walter Reed Medical Center. He was chair of obstetrics and gynecology at the University of Colorado for 20 years and is now a clinical professor at Stanford University School of Medicine. Ron and his wife, Jane, have been collectors of early American maps for over 35 years. He has lectured about history and cartography across the country, and his most recent publication is an alternative history novel, The Long Shot, The Secret History of 1776. I give you Ron Gibbs.
Thank you, Tom. Let's drum roll.
You hear that?
Not yet.
Hold on.
Well, thank you, Tom. Could we put this in visual mode? Thank you, Tom, for the very gracious introduction. And good evening to everyone in the eastern half of the country, and good afternoon to everyone in the western half. It's a great honor to be presenting this exactly on George Washington's 289th birthday. He would have been born at 10 o'clock this morning, Eastern time. So my thanks to Ron Grimm and to Naomi Heiser for the invitation and for setting this up. Well, the title is George Washington and the American Revolution, 1775, 1776. And you know that during these first two precarious years of the American Revolution, the outcome was often in doubt. So in this presentation, we're going to explore these critical times using a number of historic maps, also looking at iconic images and some present-day photographs. Come on, let's jump back 250 years. Next slide, please. So the materials and images will appear in the digital gallery. This was created by Tom. That's Tom on the right with his pet bear behind him. And the exhibit contains now almost 100 cartographic exhibits. They have zooming features and dots, and we'll demonstrate those. This exhibit was co-authored by Tom and by Courtney Spikes, shown in the lower right. Courtney is Vice President for Southern California, and by me, and you'll be able to come back and look at this exhibit at your own leisure. Next slide, please. So this lecture provides the historic backdrop for my new historical novel called The Long Shot, The Secret History of 1776. And this asks, what would have happened if General George Washington had been shot in 1776? What would have happened to him? What would have happened to the whole American Revolution? And for members of the Map Society, you'll note that the cover is of a 1770s map of New York City. And there is a whole front section in the book which contains maps from our personal collection. So next slide, please. So we're going to go now to the digital gallery and set up the link to demonstrate this. Ready, Tom?
Yep.
Great. So this is the Charles Wilson Peale portrait of George Washington, the central figure of our story. George Washington was tall, he was powerful, and said to be among the best horsemen in North America. Tom, let's just turn on the dots. And if we go at dot number 3 and zoom down on that, we see how Peale captured the countenance of George Washington. Notice his confidence and his iron will. These were characteristics that would serve him well during the long 8 years of the American Revolution. Well, Congress is meeting in Philadelphia in June 1775, and Washington is unanimously appointed commander-in-chief. But critical events actually took place 2 months before that and 300 miles to the north. Next slide, please. So after 12 years of political struggle, the American Revolutionary War breaks out here in New England. And it's fitting that our first map is this handsome Thomas Jeffries map of southern New England, showing Massachusetts Bay Colony, Connecticut Colony, and Rhode Island. Now let's go down, Tom, and zoom in the vicinity of dot number 1, and we'll take a look there at Boston. So Boston is a peninsula right there, and it has been occupied by the British Army since the Boston Tea Party, which occurred in December 1773. Now, out a little bit to the west, at dot number 2 is the village of Lexington, and a little farther west is the village of Concord. And here in April 1775 were fired the shots heard round the world. So a British column is sent to seize a cache of colonial arms in Concord and even try to capture the Patriot leaders. But the American militia turns out and attacks the British Army on their retreat back to Boston. The vaunted British Army suffers heavy casualties from the harassing Americans. Next slide. Well, this is a charming map based upon the observations of British military engineer Lieutenant Page. It was printed in 1775, and this copy is in the Leventhal Map Center at the Boston Public Library. Now, as we can see right around dot number 1, that's Boston on a peninsula. It's a town of about 10,000, making it about the 3rd largest city in British North America. So the British Army is in Boston, they control Boston, and the Royal Navy controls the extensive waterways of Boston Harbor. Tom, let's go down and look at dot number 2. And this is across the Charles River. And in June 1775, so about 2 months after Lexington and Concord, the Americans throw up earthwork fortifications from which their cannon can fire down on Boston. Now, dot number 4 shows that the British general at the time, his name was Thomas Gage, well, he's an imperialist and he's not about to put up with the impudence of these colonialists. So he decides to attack the American positions in coming down to what's known as the Battle of Bunker Hill. So temporarily, let's go to the next map. So this is the action at Breed's Hill. That's actually where the battle was fought. It's erroneously been called the Battle of Bunker Hill ever since. And there are several editions of this map. This is actually a later edition from 1797, published in New York. And this copy is also from the Leventhal Center in Boston. Well, dot number 1, if we look down at that, shows Royal Navy ships which are beginning to bombard the American fortifications while the British Army is forming up for the attack. And Tom, now let's go over to dot number 5, because dot number 5 is Warren's Redoubt. This is the center of the American earthwork fortifications. And Warren's Redoubt is named in honor of Dr. Joseph Warren. He was a citizen soldier, a militia general, and one of the most prominent physicians in Boston. And we'll hear about him just in a little bit. So now let's go down and look at dot number 2 on the map, because this is where the British Army lands. The British lines are shown in red on the map. The American lines are shown in blue, and the British form an attack. And over at dot number 3, it shows that the British take the American positions, but only on their 3rd assault after the American ammunition runs out. And this victory for the British comes at tremendous cost of casualties. And the British never forget the lesson that they learned from attacking trenched Americans. Now, dot number 4 up in the upper left, this shows the path of the retreating Americans off the Charlestown Peninsula. Well, to complete the story in Boston, we have to go back to the previous map and take a look at the vicinity of dot number 3. So the Battle of Bunker Hill takes place in June 1775. George Washington arrives to take command in July 1775. And then for the rest of 1775, as the militia pours in, they're stalemate. And they're stalemate in the first couple of months of 1776. And then in March 1776, George Washington brilliantly takes advantage of a British oversight, and he fortifies this hill called Dorchester Hill, Dorchester Heights, overlooking Boston. And at this point, the British know that they're done in for from the American cannon, and they are forced to retreat from Boston, and they sail off to Nova Scotia in Canada. But George Washington knows that they're going to have to return. Well, let's go ahead, and I want to show you some of the famous images of the time. This is the John Trumbull painting showing the Battle of Bunker Hill. That's Joseph Warren lying down mortally wounded, and a very nasty looking redcoat is about to run him through with his bayonet. And there is a heroic American pleading for Warren's life. But Warren gives his life, and this is a very heroic rendition of the end of the battle. Now, the next painting is of the British evacuation from Boston. So there's a negotiation between the British general and George Washington, and the British general says, look, if you let us go unharassed, we will leave Boston intact. But if you harass our evacuation on the ships, we're going to burn Boston to the ground. So the British, as you can see, with many loyalists, board their ships and they sail off to far off Nova Scotia. Next map. Well, this great map is based upon the observations of British Lieutenant Bernard Ratzer. It was done in 1767 and printed in 1776 by the firm of Jeffries and Faden of London. And this copy is from the New York Public Library. Well, George Washington knew that the British would have to return, and he presumes that they're coming back to New York. Why? Because New York is in the center of the American colony, center of the population centers at any rate. There are many loyalists in New York. And look, as the map shows, at the network of waterways, rivers, and bays. And the Royal Navy will have control of these and give the initiative entirely to the British. Now, let's take a look at dot number 2, Tom, because this is my favorite part of this map. And as you can see here, this is a view of what it would have been like 250 years ago to sail into New York Harbor and enjoy New York City. Now let's go and take a look at dot number 1, a little farther up. And dot number 1 shows us that New York City is on the southern tip of the island of Manhattan. It's a town of about 20,000, making it the second largest city in British North America, second only to Philadelphia. And it's a bustling center of trade. And it's already said of New Yorkers that they speak very fast, very loud, and all at once. Next slide. I can see smiles on some of the New Yorkers in the audience. Well, the British Army is now under command of General William Howe, who led the attack back at Bunker Hill. And the Royal Navy is under command of his brother. His brother is Admiral Richard Howe. So Admiral Richard Howe, behind his back, has a nickname that his men call him, and they call him Black Dick. And they call him Black Dick because of his swarthy complexion and also because of his saturnine personality. Well, the Howe brothers disembark at Staten Island after their long voyage back to New York from Nova Scotia. And this is late July 1776. And just a few weeks ago, on July 4th, 1776, the Continental Congress has just signed the Declaration of Independence from England. But now the cause of independence faces a grave threat. Well, General Howe, let me tell you a bit about him. He's a veteran commander, a superb tactician, and wise to the ways of war in North America. But he likes Americans, and he's trying to put down the revolution with minimum bloodshed. And as a result, he lets opportunities slip through his fingers. Next map, please. Well, this is a partner map to the previous map. This is also done by Lieutenant Bernard Ratzer and shows New York in detail. This copy is from the New York Public Library. So the city, again, about 20,000. That's the Hudson River, or then called the North River, to the left, and the East or the Sound River to the right. Now, there are many points of interest that you can explore if you come back to the digital gallery. I just want to point out two of these. Dot number 2, Tom. Dot number 2 is Trinity Church. And in the churchyard of Trinity Church still is buried none other than Alexander Hamilton. And if we go down to dot number 4, on the very southern tip, this is Old Fort George, which was used to defend New York Harbor. So beginning in the spring 1776, George Washington moves his army from Boston to build defenses in New York City and Manhattan and to await the British. Next map. Well, this is one of my favorite maps. This is Howe's campaign map and shows in rich detail both the terrain and the tactics. And overall, we have a perspective in the center lower part, which is lower New York Bay. And Tom, if we go up the Hudson River, this has a span of about 20 miles way to the tip above the tip of Manhattan. Now, dot number 1 in the lower left, this shows Staten Island, where the British landed after coming from Nova Scotia, and this is their staging ground. Late July, early August, 1776. Well, Howe has a huge army, 30,000 soldiers, 10,000 seamen, over 400 ships. It's the biggest force ever sent to North America up until that time. And facing him is George Washington and his army of 20,000. So he's got a smaller army, and much of his army are raw, untested militia. Well, dot number 2, just across the bay, shows where the British landed, made an amphibious landing on August 22nd, 1776, at a place then called and still called Gravesend Bay. But the Americans decide not to contest the landing, and they pull back to fortified positions at dots number 5 and number 6. So dot number 6 is the rear American position along the East River, and dot number 5 is the forward American position along the heights of Guion. And the next thing that we're going to look at is the Battle of Brooklyn, or the Battle of Long Island. On the gallery, we have, we'll slip through the, oh, I'm sorry, Tom, let's take a look at the next photograph. So this is a photograph of Gravesend Bay, a modern photograph, And as you can see, it's a broad, wide beach. It was just perfect for the British amphibious landing in 1776. And if you'd ever want to invade Brooklyn, this is a great place for you to carry out an invasion also. So the next map. Well, 5 days after the British land at Gravesend Bay, here was the situation in Brooklyn. I venture to guess that very few people walking the streets of Brooklyn know that the largest battle of the American Revolution took place right in their neighborhood. And this map is from Stedman's History of the War, 1794, and this copy is from the Rumsey Library. Now, dot number 2 is the American position to the rear, and you can see the entrenchments and fortifications sketched out. And then if we go away from the river, we look at dot number 6 rather. These are the American fortifications along the heights. Now, Tom, let's just zoom out a little bit because we want to get a bird's eye view. So on the morning of August 27th, dot number 1 shows a Hessian attack on the center of the American line. And dot number 5 shows a British attack on the American right. But these two attacks are mere feints because the main British column is over there on the right at dot number 4. And the main British column is carrying out an all-night flanking maneuver, perfectly concealed on the night of August 26th, August 27th. You can follow the dotted line, and they get to the rear of the American positions, and the outcome is a rout. Over 1,000 Americans are killed, wounded, or captured. So let's take a look at dot number 3 on this map. But characteristically, Howe does not press his advantage, at least not immediately, and that allows the Americans to retreat under cover of a pea soup thick fog from Brooklyn over to the safety of Manhattan. And the fog is called by the men an act of providence. Let's take a look at a couple of other images now. Well, this is the Alonzo Chapel painting. It's action-packed, and it shows what was going on the battle for the American right wing. So dot number 2 over there to the right, this shows the old stone house, and this was the center of the American right wing. Dot number 3 shows the American line, and if we zoom down on that, you can see a figure on horseback with his right arm raised. This almost certainly is the American general and hero, General William Alexander, also called Lord Sterling. And at dot number 4, coming in through the gun smoke, is the red British line. So the heroism shown by the Americans here allows time for retreat. Now, before we leave this painting, let's go to the lower right corner and look at dot number 1. Many of the Americans are able to wade and swim across Gowanus Creek to escape the oncoming British, and they go to the prepared positions near the East River. Next slide, please. Well, here is the old stone house today. It's a museum, and it looks very much the same as it did in August 1776, except for the addition of the air conditioning. And it's on the corner of a playground, and there is adjacent to it a middle school named General William Alexander Middle School. Now, the next slide is Gowanus Creek as it appears today. It's heavily industrialized, so it's hard to get an idea as to its verdant nature back in 1776, but it's being cleaned up. I just read an article in the New York Times a couple of weeks ago that there's a lot of sludge in the bottom, and the sludge at the bottom was described as black mayonnaise. So there's a lot of cleaning up to do. Next slide. Well, here is a view fairly recently from the embarkation point that Washington and his army would have made in evacuating Brooklyn. So the piers in the foreground are the Brooklyn piers. That's the East River in the midground, and back are the skyscrapers of present-day Manhattan. And Tom, if you look at about the fourth skyscraper from the right, that's the World Trade Center. So I took this photograph before 2001. Next slide. Well, compiled and drawn by Henry P. Johnston in 1878, this map shows what Manhattan looked like in rich topographical detail in 1776. So if we look down at the southern tip at the left, that's New York City at dot number 3. And then if we scan to the upper part of Manhattan, that's Harlem Heights up at dot number 6. So about 5,000 men, a quarter of Washington's army, are down in New York, and about 10,000 are up here at Harlem Heights. And at dot number 2, this shows that the remaining quarter of Washington's army is thinly spread out in trenches facing the East River. Washington has his whole army spread out because he doesn't know where the British are going to attack. And the attack comes on Sunday morning, September the 15th, 1776, right here at dot number 2, at a place then called and still called today Gibbs Bay. And it turns out that it's the weakest point in Washington's line. This is at the foot of 34th Street, right by NYU Medical Center. Well, Washington has been up at his headquarters. He hears the firing and he runs and he takes his horse with a couple of aides to dot number 1. Dot number 1 is a cornfield in 1776. And this today would be right at the intersection of about 42nd Street, right by present-day New York Public Library. Well, Washington is aghast. His Connecticut militia are panicked and they're running away, and he tries to rally the men to form a line, but they're too panic-stricken and he cannot prevent their panic. At this point, British Rangers, having landed at Gibbs Bay, are now getting very close to George Washington, probably within 100 to 200 yards. And by true history, George Washington was never shot, but it is in fact plausible that he could have been shot. And in my book, this is where it happens on Sunday morning, September 15th, 1776. And after George Washington gets shot, there's a thrilling cascade of political, military, and medical events. And what happens? Well, to see what happens, please take a look at the book if you like history and see what happens. Well, now let's get back to real history. Oh, and over there at dot number 4, this is the Murray Mansion. The Murrays are loyalists. This is an area still called Murray Hill today. And Howe and his men rest here. And Tom, let's zoom out a little bit. And by Howe and his men resting at dot number 5, that allows the 5,000 men who were otherwise pinched off at New York City to escape up a road up the west side of Manhattan and to join the rest of Washington's forces up in Harlem Heights. Now, before we leave this map, let's go up to dot number 8 and let's zoom down on that. So dot number 8 is a fortification called Fort Washington, and there's a great story about that, and we'll take a look at that in a minute. But before we do, let's take a look at a couple of modern photographs. Next slide. So this would be the view if you were a Connecticut militiaman on the morning of Sunday, September the 15th. This is looking right from the foot of 34th Street out into the East River. You'd be peering over your earthwork trenches, and out where those modern ships are, you would have been full of fear to see Royal Navy ships. So the terrain has not changed all that much. And the next slide, this shows a plaque erected to Mary Lindley Murray. Mary Lindley Murray, it is said by perhaps apocryphal history, entertained General Howe and delayed him from cutting off the American retreat. So I've looked for this plaque all around there. I think it's no longer there, but this is a memorial to Mary Lindley Murray. Next slide. Well, in 1777, William Fadden of London published this rich topographical map of the capture of Fort Washington by British and Hessian troops in November 1776, and this copy is from the Library of Congress. So dot number 1 shows the fort. So the story is that George Washington had to retreat from Manhattan in late October because the British carried out a waterborne flanking maneuver into Westchester County. But George Washington left the fort manned by about 2,500 men and with precious materiel. The thinking was that it could hold out for weeks, and if necessary, the men could escape, as we can see, down to Jeffrey's Hook, and then they could cross over the Hudson River over to Fort Lee. Well, in the meantime, George Washington retreated from Manhattan to White Plains, about 17 miles north of Manhattan. He lost yet another battle and then retreated to Fort Lee. This was named for American General Charles Lee. And you can see Fort Lee over there, dot number 5. Well, dots number 2.
No sound.
Oh, can you hear now?
Yep, you're good.
Okay, so let's just hold right there. So dots number 2, 3, and 4 show the 3-pronged British and Hessian attack. Dot number 2 is a British attack coming in from the south. Dot number 3 is a Hessian attack coming in from the north. And dot number 4 is a British amphibious landing coming in from Harlem Creek or Harlem River. Well, 8,000 British and Hessian troops are going against the 2,500 at Fort Washington. And the fort, rather than holding out for weeks, surrenders after just 5 hours. It is the biggest calamity of the war in the North, and George Washington's reputation is on the line. Next slide, Tom. So this magnificent watercolor is by...
No sound.
Can we
No
hear?
Sound. I have sound.
Fine.
Have
You're
sound.
fine. You're fine. Bill's in trouble.
Keep going?
Keep going. You're fine.
So this watercolor is by Captain Thomas Davies of the Royal Artillery, and it captures the moment of the attack on Fort Washington. So dot number 1 is Harlem Creek. From here we can see dot number 2 is where the British amphibious landing takes place. And then, Tom, if we just zoom out way over there at dot number 3, we get a peek across the Hudson River. We see British ships, and then we see in the background the Palisades of New Jersey. And dot number 4 is Fort Washington. So this is a magnificent view of what it would have been like to be in Upper Manhattan in 1776, and it gives you a feel as if you were there. Next slide. So this is a plaque today to the heroic defenders of Fort Washington, and this is in the very fashionable area of Washington Heights. Next map. So next is the Samuel Holland map of 1776, and shows the actions in New Jersey and Pennsylvania, and New York. This copy is from the Library of Congress. So to continue our story, Tom, let's go down to dot number 1. So dot number 1 shows the location of Fort Lee, which George Washington has to evacuate when pressed by the British in late November 1776. And dot number 2, let's take a look at dot number 1 and 2. Dot number 2 shows us the Delaware River, and Washington gets chased all the way across New Jersey by the British, and he crosses over the Delaware River. His engineers destroy all the bridges, and his scouts capture all of the boats, and Washington is safely over in Pennsylvania, at least for the time being. This is mid-December 1776. Meanwhile, British General Howe thinks the Americans are beaten, and he goes into winter quarters. And right above dot number 2 is the village of Trenton. And at the end of his line, he leaves a contingent of 1,400 Hessians. Hessians are German mercenaries. And this is the end of the British line. And before we leave here, let's take a look at dot number 3. This marks Philadelphia. Philadelphia is the American rebel capital. It's the largest city in North America, 30,000. It's a center then, as it is today, of science, of culture, and of medicine. And it's my hometown as well. Okay, we're getting to the end of the story now. And the next image is perhaps the most famous historic painting in American history. This is Emanuel Lewitz's rendition of Washington crossing the Delaware, and this was done 75 years after the crossing. This copy is in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So exactly why did George Washington cross the Delaware, and which way was he going? Well, with George Washington's back to the wall, he reasoned that the only hope for the cause of independence, after defeat, and after retreat, was to attack. And it's Christmas night, 1776, and here he is standing in a rowboat, crossing the ice-packed Delaware River, crossing from Pennsylvania to New Jersey, on his way to attack the isolated Hessian outpost at Trenton. There's only one problem with this magnificent painting. It's just loaded with historic errors. So it looks like it's painted in daylight. The crossing occurred at night. George Washington, in dot number 1, is shown standing in a rowboat. He was too good a boatman to know that he could do that. Dot number 2 shows that these boats are rowboats. This was not the kind of craft that was used. We'll look at those in a second. And dot number 3, there's Old Glory. Well, this rendition of the flag by Betsy Ross, that didn't appear till well into 1777, about 8 months later. And in the background, we see horses and cannon crammed onto these boats. They would have fallen distinctly into the river. So despite the historic errors, this is one of the most beloved paintings in American history and is known by all. Next image. Well, I took this photograph on a fine spring afternoon to show one thing. This is the actual crossing point as it appears today, and to show that the Delaware River then, as it is now, is about 300 yards wide. Next slide. And here is a photograph of the actual boats used in the crossing. They're called Durham boats, and they were used for traffic crossing and up and down the Delaware River, much bigger than the rowboats shown in Lewitz's painting. Next map. Well, this map, also by William Faden, shows the heroic actions of the American troops between December 26th, 1776, and January 3rd, 1777. So at dot number 1, Tom, we just want to show that this is the Hessian outpost, 1,400 men at Trenton. And then let's go over to the left and look at dot number 2, because this is the American encampment at Newtown. So on Christmas night, Washington marches his army up to dot number 3 there at McConkey's Ferry and crosses the river. And this is where Lloyd's painting would have taken place. Now, dot number 4 and dot number 5 show that the American army divides into 2 columns. They're about 2 miles apart, and by great fortune, they converge at dot number 6 on Trenton. And the battle is over in an hour. Many of the Hessians are recovering from Christmas celebration, and it is a great victory, a small but great victory, and Washington has about 1,000 prisoners. He's now pretty well isolated and decides to march his men and his prisoners back over to Pennsylvania. But look at dot number 7 now. But a week later, he returns to New Jersey, has another victory at the town of Princeton, and the twin victories breathe new life into the cause of independence, and George Washington is recognized as a battlefield commander. We're going to look at a couple of more images now, and the next image is the heroic picture of George Washington receiving the surrender of the Hessians at the Battle of Trenton, a very glorious photograph of Washington. And the next image shows the Battle of Trenton Monument in the town of Trenton today. This is located right at the point where the Northern American column came in, set up their cannon, and began to rake the Hessians. And today, next slide, Princeton Battlefield is a state park with many preserved period buildings, many interpretive placards and monuments. Next slide. Now, before we leave, I think it's only fair to do justice to William Faden, who was a cartographer. He was born in 1749 and lived till 1836, and was one of the most prominent London map makers and map dealers at the time. He was a partner in Jeffries and Faden, and in 1776, he became the sole owner. His timing was magnificent because there was fantastic interest in England in the war in North America, and great interest in his battle maps, many of which come down to today. Well, next image. So the war would go on for another 5 years, with still more defeats and still more retreats for George Washington, but he held the army together, won just enough times, and with the aid of the French, ultimately pulled off victory here at Yorktown. And this is a magnificent John Trumbull painting. It is huge, 12 feet by 18 feet in the Capitol Rotunda. And this victory ends the fighting war, but the Treaty of Paris giving American independence does not get signed for another 2 years. But if we reflect over the last 250 years, we remember that the entire destiny of our country hung by a mere thread for those last few months of 1776 and those first few days of 1777. And indeed, the destiny of our country rested heavily at that time on the broad shoulders of one man, General George Washington, at dot number 1. So, Tom, we now want to go back from the gallery to finish up in the PowerPoint with a few concluding words. And for more information on these incredibly historic times, these are references. My website has a number of videos and blogs. Bernard Schachter has a magnificent book called George Washington's America, Biography Through His Maps. And on the next slide, in 2016, I did this article for the IMCOS Journal, which also recounts these critical years. And at this point, I'll go to the last point and say, thank you for your attention. And we do have time for questions or comments, and a good evening to all.
Hey, Ron, thanks for that very fascinating talk. I appreciate how you've integrated the maps, the artwork, and the actual landscapes today. I think often as we read the history of the Revolutionary War and try to follow the action of the battles, it really doesn't quite make a picture in our mind till we look at the maps. And I think you've helped visualize that very well. Now, okay, I'll do an advertisement for Ron. When I was planning on scheduling this talk back in the fall, I bought a copy of Ron's book. I recommend it to you. I mean, it is an alternative history, but I think if you read it as a map lover, you will enjoy the geographical detail. But I think you'll also enjoy the medical detail because one of the main characters is a doctor in George Washington's army.
Not saying anything.
I do recommend the book to you. Now, I guess let's see if there's some questions.
Thanks for the plug of the book, Ron.
Hey, okay. Here's one, Ron. This is fantastic. I wish every middle school student could view this presentation. You've gotten quite a few compliments here.
Thank you. One of my great pleasures giving an earlier version of this to my grandson's class, and he got to introduce me. That was a thrill.
Okay.
Ron, are there any maps that have been made that were made or found from the American side of things?
There were sketches, but most of the maps were British, done to quench the thirst of the British public for news of the war in America. That's a great hat, by the way, Tom. I think we have to go out next Halloween together. But by the way, I'm an obstetrician by training, and I tried to find out about George Washington's birth. So not surprisingly, there's not a lot known, but he was born at 10 o'clock in the morning. He was the firstborn of his mother. Ron Chernow's book about him says that he was born of unusual heft. And we presume that the delivery was uncomplicated because his mother, Mary Ball Washington, had about 4 or 5 other children, 2 within the next couple of years. So it was an uncomplicated delivery, and we're happy about that.
Were there any efforts to unseat him after his first few defeats?
Well, there was. There was a lot of rivalry. One of his rivals was General Charles Lee. In my book, I play up that and play with history. And then in 1777, there was an effort to unseat him, and this was called the Conway Cabal. So Washington plays an unusual role in American history. He was Olympian in his standing, but not untouched. Not untouched.
Okay, I think there are a few questions now. Andrew Ronald's comments and asks, just a second. You mentioned that when the British flanked the right wing, they let it slip through their fingers. I missed what you had said. Was it that they failed to continue advancing when they should have? Also, why did Fort Washington cave in so quickly?
Yeah, okay. So that's right. So at the Battle of Brooklyn, the Battle of Long Island, the British carry out a flanking maneuver, capture about 1,000 of Washington's men, but he's got almost 9,000 more in Long Island and Brooklyn. They are holed up in the fortifications next to the East River, but Howe characteristically does not press the attack. He rests his men, thinking that he can get them, thinking that they are trapped by the Royal Navy and that they cannot cross the East River. The fog comes in, the Americans are able to escape, and Howe's reluctance allows them to escape. At Fort Washington, why did it cave in so quickly? It was just overconfidence by the Americans and overwhelming force by the British and Hessians.
Here's a comment from Mike Davis, and I might respond to this as well. The resolution of the maps is impressive. Were they specially ordered from the Library of Congress?
I'm going to ask Tom, the mastermind of the digital gallery, to address that.
Yeah, so the Library of Congress and Rumsey and the New York Public Library were the primary sources of the maps, and I took the maximum resolution that was available from each of those sources. And then it's noted on every image on the gallery. If you go to the curated text, you can see it there, the actual source there.
Okay, I would also add that the Leventhal Map Center has been working over the years to create a portal of Revolutionary War maps, gleaning digital images from most of the major collections. And actually today, in the last week, the Leventhal folks and the folks at Mount Vernon have been discussing continuing to add material to that collection so that there will be one central place for looking for Revolutionary War maps. I'm sorry, that's my advertisement for today.
Good one, Ron. Thank you.
Hi, Steve.
Hey, Ron. Hey, Ron, what's the practical distance that the troops could move at that time if they're moving like from New York to White Plains? How much territory could they actually cover in a day's march?
Yeah, so from his position in Harlem Heights up to White Plains, that was about 16 or 17 miles. That was a good 2 or 3 days march.
It's very hilly up here. It is, yeah.
Yeah. And they had long baggage trains. They could not move very quickly. So at least 2 or 3 days.
Okay, here's a message from Tim Weiskell. Do you know about maps Washington may have made? He drew maps in West Virginia as part of his experience on the Western frontier. For example, commerce and cartography on the colonial frontiers, re-examining American and African history.
So Washington, of course, was trained as a surveyor, and I think he had a surveyor's eye for terrain and topography.
Okay, Durs Anderson, Washington was a surveyor. Did that understanding of the landscape help him guide his battle decisions?
Oh yeah. I think so. He understood terrain very well, but early in his career, he suffered the problem of a novice commander-in-chief. He was given to overly complex battle plans, and the armies had no way of communicating except by messenger on horseback, and that led to more complications for him often.
In regard to the question about maps that George Washington did, that was one of Ed Redmond's strong research interests. His master's thesis actually revised a list that Lawrence Martin did in the 1930s, trying to locate all the surveys and the maps that Washington had done.
Right. By the way, I see on the questions, there are references to David McCullough's book, 1776. That's a great read. And then last year or the year before, Rick Atkinson's The British Are Coming deals with the first part of the American Revolution. Atkinson plans to do a Revolutionary War trilogy.
Okay, here's a question from Roger Carlback. I recall that there was a contingent of maybe 400 from ? Who were intentionally sacrificed as a suicide maneuver to get time for the rest of the army to get to Manhattan. This would be comparable to Churchill's sacrifice of a small army to get time for the main force to escape from the Dunkirk beach.
Well, if we're talking about the retreat from Brooklyn to Manhattan, that was under the cover of fog, there was a rear guard left fires burning to deceive the British. But George Washington is said to be about the last man off Brooklyn onto the boats to getting over to Manhattan. So that that was not the version that I know of the sacrificial group of 400.
Yeah, I think he's referring to, I'm from Maryland, and we're very proud of the fact that 400 of our men held the heights there in Brooklyn and allowed the retreat. It's, again, it's something we know very. In fact, George Washington said something like, had I had all Marylanders there that day, we wouldn't never have had to retreat.
Okay, okay, that is exactly the version that I know. And on the American right wing, under Sterling, there were some of the best troops in Washington's army, including the Marylanders and the Delawareans. And there was a book that came out about 2 or 3 years ago called Washington's Immortals, about the Maryland troops. So, so John Green, thank you for mentioning that. And it's part of the great story. So that was the pullback on the first day of the battle. And they did suffer heavily.
Okay, Ron, I'd like to thank you for your presentation and your attention to the questions. And as is our custom in the Washington Map Society, we'd like to present you with some speaker gifts. And following in the tradition that I've been doing the rest of the year, I have some note cards by a company here in Washington, D.C. called, the company is called Cherry Blossom Creative, and they've done a set for San Francisco. So we'll send you a set of San Francisco note cards, and also a cut line map showing the street pattern of San Francisco as well.
Well, much appreciated. I know exactly where they will go.
Okay, good. I'm glad. So at this point, I don't know, do you have any more comments, Ron, before we open it up for some social time?
Thanks everyone for their comments, and I'm glad so many people really enjoyed the montage of maps and images and present day photographs.
Oh, I see we have an American flag flying there.
Thank you, Steve.
Great job, Ron.
Thank you, Ron.
Thanks.
Congrats.
Hey, Ron. Ron,
Nice job, Dad.
Hey, Wes, hi.
hi there. You have a copy of the Ratzer map, at least one of the editions. Would you tell us about, at least you used to have it, why that's such an important map for a collector of your subject matter?
Well, okay. And the story is that right after September 11th, I made a trip to New York to visit friends and show them my support. And I went to a map dealer who had the Bernard Ratzer map. It was the second Ratzer map. And I'm looking at it right now. It's directly above me. And the map was just in fair condition. But I knew it was an important map, and it was sent to me at home, and I didn't know whether to buy it. So what did I do? I did the smartest thing in my map collection. I took it over to Wes's house, and I said, should I get this map? And I'll never forget what you said, Wes. You said, if you don't get this map, you're never going to forgive yourself. So, so I got the map, and it is proudly displayed right above where I'm sitting right now. So it is one of 3 great maps of New York City right on the eve of the American Revolution. One of the others is the larger Ratzer map, which had that marvelous sketch of New York Harbor. And the third is the Captain John Montresor map of Mac. All these were surveyed in about late 1760s, early 1770s. And it shows you just what the harbor and New York City was like. So they're just great. Thanks for the question. And thanks for the advice many years ago.
Hey, Ron, could you, I see there's the Ratzer map and the Ratzen plan. How are those connected?
It's the same guy. We think that he was of German extraction, but an officer in the British Army, and his name was Ratzer. But the way he scripted his name, some people misinterpreted the terminal R
As an N?
as an N.
Okay, got it. Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions? And if there are high school groups that would like to have a Zoom presentation, or other groups or book clubs, I'm game.
Well, I'd be quite interested, but for the questions of international empire at the time, because the French were quite interested in the ports of the east coast of the United States. In fact, some of their most famous geographers did some of the early maps of the Boston port. You've all seen them. They're relatively readily available in cartographies of the late 18th century in France from about the 1750s on. I'm curious whether you've followed up any of the French source material on this to compare them with the British maps and the American maps.
Well, I haven't done that per se. Of course, our American War of Independence occurs just about 10 or 12 years after the French lost their colonies in North America and Canada. And of course, the French were even interested in sticking it to the British any way they could and get even. But I'll have to follow that up, Tom. That's
Well, they were, because they did a fantastic early map and widely circulated in quarto publications. I mean, like for ship's captains, of the vulnerability of Boston as a peninsula guarded by only a couple of batteries at the neck. And then, in fact, if you look at the map in detail, it's a kind of prescription for how to take over a city. What they didn't count on was what Washington, and you pointed out so brilliantly in your own talk, figured out, was that Boston could be defended if you got a few cannons up on Dorchester Hill, or Dorchester Heights as it was called now. In effect, he got those cannons from Ticonderoga. The Green Mountain Boys brought them down overland, right? An audacious military move at the time. But once he got them, the British realized they couldn't do anything, because the level of elevation for the cannons meant that they could, in effect, blow anything out of the water.
Well, that's another great story, and the hero of that is Henry Knox, who was one of a Boston bookseller, self-taught militarian, and he became part of Washington's cabinet.
Right. Thanks so much. This is great. That's a great event here.
Well, thank you, Tom.
Okay, Ron, I guess that's about it from everybody. No other comments?
Okay. Goodbye to everybody, and remember that we will have another presentation on March 23rd by Susan Schulten. Hope to see you then.